hope that you'll take some encouragement from this lesson, both this Sunday and next Sunday, as we study from the book of Esther. And I've characterized it for such a time as this, and it's taken from the book of Esther. It's the 4th chapter, verse 14. And it's a conversation that you'll find out Mordecai is having with Esther. And Mordecai says, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. The story of Esther takes place during the rule of Ahasuerus, which means mighty man. But you probably know him better by the name of Xerxes. And Xerxes probably looked like this, not like the prior slide. Xerxes succeeded to the throne through his father, Darius, and he ruled at the time the Persian Empire, which was during a period of history between 485 and 465 BC. He governed 127 separate provinces, sometimes called satraps, that stretched all the way from India to Ethiopia. That is a huge, huge area. And it was kind of like states within the Union, kind of like the United States. His capital was the city of Shushan. Sometimes it's abbreviated Susa. And as the story unfolds, Xerxes has just returned, completely defeated, annihilated, and dejected at the hands of the Greeks in a battle called Thermopylae. Do you remember the story and the movie called 300? That's him. That's Leonidas. It was this Hollywood blockbuster based upon fact about Leonidas, who with only 300 other troops fights to the last soldier against Xerxes' army, which totaled somewhere around 1 million soldiers. And Leonidas and his 300 troops lasted just long enough to allow the Greek army from Sparta to respond and eventually turn Xerxes away. So Xerxes returns back to his capital in Susa, and he's embarrassed by the defeat. He came back to Susa and decided to throw a drinking party which lasted for 6 months. So think of it as kind of like an open house with a totally hosted bar. Of course, all things have to come to an end, even drinking binges. So to secure his position and his continued respect with the aristocracy, Xerxes decides to throw a stag party, which is for guys only, during the final 7 days of this 6-month bender. But this time, the party is for guys only and is for the who's who of Susa. Now, not wanting to offend anyone, Xerxes told everybody there that drinking was optional. But word had it that if the king took a drink, well, then everyone would take a drink, and Xerxes liked to drink. In fact, by the end of this final week, he'd had so much to drink that he came up with the brilliant idea of inviting his wife, who was the queen, to come to the party in her royal crown, quote, in order to show her beauty to the people. You can read that in Esther chapter 1, verse 11. Now, some experts have suggested that this invitation was intended for the queen, her name was Vashti, to come only in her crown, if you catch my drift. Now, it just so happens that the queen was throwing her own party at the time, which the Bible referred to as a feast. Interesting, the word feast, which is mishta, occurs as many times in the book of Esther as it does in the entire Old Testament. So Susa was apparently quite the party town. Unfortunately, Vashti wasn't really in the mood to party with a bunch of drunk guys, especially if the invitation was intended for her and her crown only, if you catch my drift. So, like any upstanding, sober woman would do, she told Xerxes no. Needless to say, Xerxes was not happy with her response to his invitation. Here is the most powerful ruler of the known world, and his own wife won't even obey his command. And this in the presence of all of his hoi polloi friends out of Susa. No apparently did not mean no, and what started out as a domestic dispute then mushrooms into this full-blown political crisis. So, what's a king to do? Well, you turn to your trusted, equally drunk and inebriated advisors and ask them for advice. One of these advisors' name is Memucan. Now, Memucan was probably the most brilliant one of the advisors, but given in his particular state, probably wasn't make the best recommendations. But here's what he suggested to the king. He said that if nothing is done about this crisis, then all of the women in the kingdom are going to follow the queen's example and they will revolt, which would leave all of the men without their partners, including certain matrimonial benefits, if you catch my drift. So what's a king to do? Well, what you do is you quickly pass emergency divorce legislation, which is exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of drunk guys. And the guts of the law is this: the queen was to never see the king again, and her crown was to be given to another. That way, the guys thought, the entire empire would know that a man was truly the king of his castle. This, of course, was political deflection or gaslighting at its best, since the genesis of the legislation was due to the fact that the queen had very clearly demonstrated that the king was not the king of his own castle. But then again, facts have a way of becoming inconvenient if it doesn't fit the narrative. Who'd have thought? So, there was peace in the king's household until the effects of the emergency divorce legislation left Xerxes a very lonely man. So again, what's a king to do? I don't know. Have a beauty pageant, right? And in this beauty pageant, all the contestants are going to be virgins, and the king would literally have the pick of the litter, kind of like The Bachelor on TV. Well, you can imagine the kind of publicity that this beauty contest generated. I mean, there was a lot of excitement in Susa. And it got the attention of a guy by the name of Mordecai. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of his history. He is the son of Jair, who was the son of Shimei, who is the son of Kish. I'm just telling you that because that information will become very helpful and useful as we consider the rest of the story. That kind of excitement turned Xerxes from this to this. Now, Mordecai had an orphaned cousin whom he had adopted as his own, and her name in the Jewish language was Hadassah. Or in the Persian Empire, it was Ishtar, hence where we get the name Esther. Now, Hadassah means myrtle, like the myrtle tree, a very fragrant, beautiful tree. And the Persian name of Ishtar means star. So Esther was lovely and beautiful, just like a rising star. And I wanted to show you a picture of Mordecai. This is Mordecai. Now, as luck would have it, Esther gets discovered in the beauty contest and is taken to Susa for a year of beauty treatments, including diet, exercise, pedicures, manicures, everything. I mean, think of spending a year at the Golden Door, just north of here. The year-long spa treatment included 6 months of perfumes and preparations for her beautification, and another 6-month period where she is being flowered and massaged with myrrh and perfumed oils. Now, Hegai, who happens to be one of the king's eunuchs, and you know what a eunuch is, right? This is a male that has probably either been chemically or likely physically castrated so that he can't have relations with the women that the king wants to be with. So Hegai, the eunuch, takes a real shining to Esther. And he made sure that Esther got all of her beauty treatments. He even made sure that Esther got an allowance. I don't know why you would need an allowance. Everything is being provided you, but Esther gets an allowance, gets all the beauty treatments, and for good measure, Hegai arranges for Esther to have 7 servants from the king's palace accompany her in everything she does, just for good measure. He then moved her and the servants to the best place in what the Bible calls the house of women, which is just a very polite way of saying harem. Tragically, the beautiful young virgins who were there for the king's pleasure, but eventually passed over, could never, ever marry, and eventually became essentially widows, since they were forbidden to ever marry, as they were, or at least once had been, part of the king's harem. So much for March's Women's Month, right? Now, during her year-long preparation at the salon, Esther has never really revealed her Jewish heritage to anyone except for Mordecai, her adoptive father, because he had encouraged her to, you might want to keep that part of your history a mystery. So she never revealed it to anybody. But like any adoptive dad, Mordecai worried a lot about Esther. And every day, he would walk up and down in front of the women's quarters, harem, to keep an eye on Esther. And after 12 months, this beautification process has been completed. Each woman of the harem, at the king's invitation, was escorted into the palace and would take something special from the harem to give to the king. She would go to the palace in the evening, and return in the morning with the king's eunuch, who would then keep this particular woman with the rest of the concubines, but this time in a second house or harem. And unless the king ever asked for her again, she would remain there forever. Now, when it came to Esther's turn, rather than her selecting something special for the king herself, she asked Hegai for his opinion. And in doing that, Esther just engendered all sorts of goodwill and good feelings between herself and Hegai and the other people serving in the king's palace. And when you think about it, who better than Hegai to know what to bring to the king, because Hegai and the king were in constant contact. So Hegai would likely know what was really on the king's mind in terms of what he would really like as a gift. And apparently, Esther brought the right stuff, because she did not come back the next morning. She was a hot chick. Instead of coming back, Xerxes says, "You're it," names her the queen, and threw another party. Okay, well, maybe she didn't look like the hot chick. Maybe she looked more like this. So the king now has appointed her the queen, and he is so happy that he proclaims a national holiday and put on a huge party for all of his guests. Now, the king knows how to throw parties, right? The king loves Esther. And this is just another biblical story which reveals to all of us that a person of obscurity can be brought to a place of greatness. Because Esther's story is not unique. If you go through the Bible, which we do, we've studied about Joseph. We've talked about Ruth. We've discussed Daniel. We've even talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I mean, just to name a few of people who were pulled out of complete obscurity and placed into an area of prominence that had a significant impact on the nation with whom they were serving. Now, Esther, by this time, had been very instrumental in getting her cousin, Mordecai, promoted. So he sat in front of the king's gate, which was like where all the traffic was going in and out to the city, and that's the place where you wanted to be. You heard the news, you saw what was going on, you saw who was going in, you saw who was leaving, you saw the traffic, you saw the cars, you saw everything. So Mordecai has now been promoted to Xerxes' staff and is hanging out in front of the king's gate, just watching what's going on. And it just so happens that Mordecai overhears two disgruntled former employees of Xerxes. They were the king's doorkeepers. He heard that they were plotting to kill the king. Now, some scholars believe that this plot originated due to the fact that Mordecai, who was a Jew, had been promoted to the king's court, which was not Jewish, which would incense the old school Persian politicos, and hence these two guys wanting to off the king. I guess you can just call it a divine coincidence that Mordecai just happened to be there and hear this conversation at just the right time. Well, Mordecai tells Esther, she's the queen, your husband is going to be offed. And Esther, understandably, tells her husband. Well, once Xerxes finds out about this assassination plot, he quickly takes care of that problem by killing the two plotters. And what happens is, he is so thrilled with the fact that Mordecai had found out about this and had shared the information with Esther, that he wanted this to be written down in the book of Chronicles. It was a written history that the king was keeping of various events and things that happened in his kingdom, so that in the future people could look back on it and say, oh, wow, Xerxes, what a guy, what a great king. So he wrote down all this really important stuff. And this happened to be one of the stories that went into that really important journal that he wanted to be sure chronicled his life and times of Xerxes. But then in walks Haman the Agagite. He's kind of the Darth Vader in the story. I mean, I don't know that he looked like this, but it does start with the same first letter. But maybe he looked more like this. So Haman is a descendant of the Amalekites. And if you remember your history, the Amalekites were the descendants of Esau, who was the archetype of a Jewish hater. Thus, if Mordecai was descended from Saul, and Haman was descended from the Amalekites, then the drama that follows is just merely the continuation of a very, very long-standing hostility that had been occurring between these families. And briefly, since Haman is an Agagite, he was a descendant of one of the kings of the Amalekites, whose name was Agag. Agag was captured, his people were eventually killed, and then later on, Agag gets executed by the prophet Samuel, and it should have been King Saul who did that, but then we know that Saul had a problem sometimes following God's instructions. So Samuel takes care of Agag. But the hostilities actually go all the way back to Moses, who had admonished Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19, quote, blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, do not forget. So needless to say, it is a centuries-old grudge whose succeeding generations have very, very long memories. Now, back at Susa, everyone is bowing down to Haman because Haman happens to be the prime minister of Susa and the Persian nation. Everyone bows down to him except for Mordecai, who is a professed Jew, and Mordecai has never shied away from telling anybody who wanted to know his Jewish family, heritage, and tradition. In fact, Mordecai had shared all of this information with Haman's servants. So it was no mystery that Mordecai is a Jew. Now, in the Persian Empire, and in Haman's eyes in particular, Mordecai not bowing down when Haman came by was the height of civil disobedience. And Haman believed that that act itself should be punished, like I should kill Mordecai. And Haman hated to be disrespected, especially at the city gate, when everyone else is doing the bowing, giving him the obeisance that he craves, except for the Jew boy, Mordecai. The problem is that Haman happened to be a student of history, and he knew that going toe-to-toe with Mordecai probably would not end well. And believing that the past could be prologue, Haman had every reason to fear Mordecai, but that never apparently sated the hate that Haman had for Mordecai. So, after giving the matter some thought, he came up with a solution to his problem. And his solution was to kill Mordecai and all of the Jewish people. This is roughly how many Jews Haman probably wanted to kill. But the most important Jew, of course, was Mordecai. And when you think about it, Hitler had nothing on Haman's genocidal madness. But this was a pretty grave final solution, and Haman couldn't do it without some help. So he enlisted his sorcerers for their advice, since there's nothing like consulting with soothsayers when you're considering the extermination of more than 1,000,000 beings on the basis of their race. Now, the sorcerers weren't consulted so much with Haman's plan, because he's the prime minister. No, he just wanted a little advice from his soothsayers about when the plan should go into effect. So, using their very sophisticated technology at the time, they rolled dice. Now, in the Persian language, dice is referred to as pur, P-U-R, hence the festival of Purim, because if you know the story about Esther, I'm not telling you anything you probably don't already know. So the Jewish people every year have the Feast of Purim, where they celebrate essentially their eventual delivery, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the soothsayers roll the dice and tell Haman, 11 months, baby. That's when you need to do it. You need to set your plan in motion 11 months from now. And that suited Haman perfectly, because there is a lot to do when it came to murdering millions of people, not the least of which was, I don't know, maybe getting the king's approval of exterminating a very substantial portion of his empire's population. So Haman goes to his boss and tells the king, kind of generically speaking, you know, there's this group of people who live among us. And king, they're just, I don't know, they're just different. And making matters worse, they don't follow your laws. So I think they shouldn't be allowed to remain in the kingdom. And in fact, I think they should be destroyed. So that's what I'm proposing. And I feel so strongly about this new proposed legislation that I will personally donate $13 million to your treasury for the purposes of seeing this law go into effect. Now, at the time, $13 million was about 2/3 of Persia's national gross domestic product. So Haman has gone to the king, says we have some different people that live among us. They shouldn't be allowed to remain. In fact, they shouldn't be allowed to live. I'll give you $13 million if you'll enact the legislation. What do you think? Well, the king ponders that. And you'll have to come back next Sunday to find out if it was an offer that was too good to refuse. But going back to my earlier comments, I would really encourage you this week to read the book of Esther. It's not long. I've gone through almost half of it for you already. So pick up where we left off if you want to know the ending. But what I do want you to remember is that this is the only book in the Bible that does not mention God. And yet, you cannot read the book of Esther and not see God's hand in every single thing that is done. Some people might call that coincidence. I don't. And when we look at our nation's tumult, its division, when we look at countries like Russia invading the Ukraine, and we ask ourselves, where is God in this? I would ask you to go read the book of Esther and ask yourself the same question, because his name's not there. But you cannot read the book of Esther and not come away convinced that God is in control. And so today, I want you to leave encouraged by knowing that even though you may not see the name, even though you may not hear the name, even though you may not feel the name, God's still in charge. We don't know where it's going. You wouldn't have known where this was going during Esther's time if you were living there. You would have panicked. But God was in control. And the God of Esther is the same God of today. The God of Esther was in control of circumstances then, and he's in control of circumstances now. So don't let the news rattle you. Don't let the media try and persuade you. Don't let your own feelings of hopelessness interfere with your ability to know for certain that God is in control. That's why you're here today, right? God is here. God is in control. God sent his son Jesus to die for each of us so that we eventually could live with God again. He's not asleep at the switch. He wasn't then, and he isn't now.